Welcome to topic 4203 on global climate governance. This presentation introduces the institutional and policy architecture that shapes international cooperation on climate change. The main aim is to understand not only which agreements exist, but also how they function in practice, how implementation is monitored, and why finance, transparency, and accountability are central to the success of climate policy. Climate governance is not a single treaty or organization. It is a layered system made up of treaty rules, negotiation forums, reporting arrangements, finance mechanisms, carbon market rules, and implementation efforts by states, regions, cities, and non-state actors. In this lecture, we move from the broad logic of cooperation to the concrete design of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. We also connect global governance to regional action through the European Green Deal, and we examine the roles of climate finance, carbon markets, and applied case studies. By the end, you should have a practical and critical understanding of how the climate regime has evolved and what its major challenges are today. The presentation is organized in a logical sequence. We begin with the question of why climate governance exists at all. Climate change is a global collective action problem, so it requires coordination beyond national borders. After establishing that foundation, we examine the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, as the core platform for negotiations, reporting, and rule development. We then trace the historical evolution from the UNFCCC to the Kyoto Protocol and from Kyoto to the Paris Agreement, showing how the governance model changed over time. From there, we focus on operational mechanisms such as nationally determined contributions, the enhanced transparency framework, and the global stocktake. These are not peripheral details, they are the machinery through which the Paris system is expected to function. The lecture then broadens to regional initiatives, especially the European Green Deal and the European Climate Law, before turning to climate finance and carbon markets under Article 6. We close with non-state actors, major governance challenges, case studies, and key takeaways. The learning objectives for topic 4203 are closely connected to the structure of the lecture. First, you should be able to define the basic concepts and institutional frameworks of global climate governance and international cooperation. Second, you should be able to describe the main goals and principles of the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and explain why these agreements differ. Third, you should understand how global and regional initiatives, such as UNFCCC mechanisms and the European Green Deal, support sustainable development and urban resilience. Fourth, you should be able to identify the roles of climate finance, carbon markets, and nationally determined contributions in the pursuit of climate targets. Finally, the topic also has an attitudinal dimension. It aims to strengthen awareness of shared environmental responsibility and the importance of collaborative action for a climate-resilient future. These outcomes are not abstract. Each later slide contributes to at least one of them, so the presentation moves systematically from knowledge acquisition to policy interpretation and critical reflection. Climate governance matters because climate change is a problem that no country can solve alone. Greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere, and the impacts of rising temperatures do not stop at national borders. This creates a classic collective action problem. All countries benefit if emissions decline, but each individual country may prefer that others bear the costs of action. Without governance, the incentive to delay, free ride, or shift responsibility becomes strong. At the same time, climate politics is not only about coordination. It is also about equity. Countries differ in their historical emissions, current economic capacities, technological capabilities, and exposure to climate risks. Governance must therefore address fairness as well as effectiveness. A successful climate regime needs rules, institutions, reporting systems, and finance arrangements that build trust and make commitments credible. It also needs to link mitigation, adaptation, and implementation. This is why climate governance is best understood not as a single agreement, but as a broader system that combines law, politics, economics, and accountability. The UNFCCC is the core framework of global climate cooperation. Adopted in 1992, it established the basic institutional platform through which countries negotiate, report, and coordinate their response to climate change. You can think of it as the operating system of the climate regime. It does not solve every problem by itself, but it hosts the processes through which major agreements and implementation rules are developed. Within the UNFCCC system, several bodies play important roles. The Conference of the Parties, or COP, is the main decision-making forum under the Convention. Under the Paris Agreement, the CMA serves a related role for decisions connected specifically to Paris. Technical and implementation work is supported by subsidiary bodies, especially SBSTA and SBI, while the Secretariat helps organize negotiations, information flows, and procedural continuity. Over time, the UNFCCC has also become the home for reporting and review processes, financial entities, and Article 6 market rule discussions. This institutional continuity is important because climate agreements require repeated negotiation, updating, and interpretation rather than a single one-time deal. A timeline helps clarify how the system evolved. The UNFCCC was adopted in 1992 as the foundational treaty. In 1997, countries negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, which added binding emission targets for a defined group of industrialized countries. Kyoto entered into force in 2005, creating a more formalized compliance and accounting structure. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted, marking a major shift in governance architecture. It entered into force in 2016 and created a new universal framework in which all parties submit nationally determined contributions. In 2023, the first global stocktake under Paris concluded, illustrating how the agreement is designed to operate through recurring cycles of review and progression. This timeline shows that the climate regime is evolutionary. It adapts through negotiated rounds, institutional learning, and changing political realities. The shift from Kyoto to Paris did not erase the earlier system. Instead, it reconfigured it, blending top-down and bottom-up elements and placing greater emphasis on transparency, inclusiveness, and ambition over time. The Kyoto Protocol is important because it represents a distinct model of global climate governance. It adopted a top-down approach in which developed countries accepted binding emission targets for a specified commitment period, especially 2008-2012. Kyoto also introduced flexibility mechanisms intended to reduce the cost of compliance. These included emissions trading, joint implementation, and the Clean Development Mechanism. Together, these tools allowed countries to meet part of their commitments through market-based cooperation rather than domestic reductions alone. This design reflected the belief that climate mitigation should be environmentally robust but also economically efficient. The Clean Development Mechanism is especially significant because it linked mitigation efforts in developing countries to investment and carbon credit generation, creating an early bridge between finance, technology transfer, and emissions accounting. However, Kyoto's structure also created political limits. Because obligations were concentrated among industrialized countries, broad participation became difficult to sustain. Even so, Kyoto remains historically important because it established strong accounting logic, formal commitment periods, and the first large-scale international carbon market architecture. One of the strengths of the Kyoto system is that compliance can be assessed after the fact. Researchers examining the first commitment period, from 2008 to 2012, were able to analyze national emissions data and carbon unit exchanges to evaluate whether countries met their targets. This made Kyoto relatively clear in legal and accounting terms. Studies show that some countries needed flexibility mechanisms in order to comply, while overall aggregate compliance among participating Annex B parties was achieved. At the same time, Kyoto's record must be interpreted carefully. Aggregate overachievement was shaped partly by structural economic changes, accounting rules, and the so-called hot air problem, not only by deep domestic transformation. Participation was also limited, which affected environmental effectiveness and political legitimacy. The broader lesson is that strong rules alone are not enough. Governance design must also encourage wide participation, durable commitment, and credible implementation. Kyoto teaches us that accounting matters, but it also shows that international climate regimes succeed only when political incentives, institutional design, and practical feasibility align over the long term. The Paris Agreement represents a different governance model. Instead of assigning binding targets only to a subset of countries, Paris asks all parties to submit nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, within a common framework. The agreement combines long-term direction with nationally determined implementation. Its core goals include holding the increase in global average temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, pursuing efforts toward 1.5 degrees, enhancing adaptation and resilience, and aligning finance flows with low greenhouse gas development. What makes Paris distinctive is not simply its goals, but its architecture. It is a hybrid system that relies on nationally chosen commitments, periodic reporting, international review, and collective assessment. Article 13 establishes the Enhanced Transparency Framework, Article 14 establishes the Global Stocktake, and Article 6 provides for cooperative approaches and market-related mechanisms. Paris, therefore, does not abandon rules. Rather, it shifts the balance away from narrow top-down target setting toward an iterative system that aims to build participation, trust, and ambition through repeated cycles of action and review. At the heart of the Paris system is the NDC cycle, sometimes called the ratchet mechanism. The idea is simple in outline but demanding in practice. First, each party communicates an NDC, typically on a 5-year cycle. Second, that NDC must be implemented through domestic policy, investment, planning, and administrative action. Third, progress is reported and reviewed through agreed transparency procedures. Fourth, the global stocktake assesses collective progress and helps inform the next round of NDCs. The Paris logic is that each successive NDC should represent progression beyond the previous one, reflecting the highest possible ambition in light of national circumstances. This is a powerful governance innovation because it turns climate cooperation into a recurring process rather than a one-off negotiation. However, it also creates vulnerabilities. If national implementation is weak, or if reporting lacks credibility, the cycle can lose force. The ratchet mechanism depends on domestic policy capacity, international trust, and public accountability. In other words, progression is not automatic, it is institutionally supported and politically contested. The Enhanced Transparency Framework, or ETF, is the accountability backbone of the Paris Agreement. Article 13 aims to provide clarity on both action and support. Countries are expected to report information on greenhouse gas emissions, progress toward NDCs, adaptation-related information where relevant, and climate finance support provided or received. These reports are then subject to technical expert review and a process of multilateral consideration. An important feature of the ETF is built-in flexibility. The framework recognizes different national capacities, especially for developing countries, while still aiming for comparable and credible information. Transparency matters because trust in climate governance depends on visibility. If countries cannot see what others are doing, confidence weakens, and so does willingness to raise ambition. The ETF therefore serves several functions at once. It improves comparability, supports learning, strengthens accountability, and connects national implementation to the broader international process. In governance terms, transparency does not replace legal obligation, but it makes cooperation more durable by creating shared information and reducing uncertainty about effort, progress, and support. The Global Stocktake, or GST, is the collective progress check built into the Paris Agreement. It assesses how far the world has moved toward the agreement's long-term goals across mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. The first GST concluded in 2023, and its significance lies in its role within the 5-year cycle. It is not only a summary exercise. It is designed to inform the next round of NDCs and thereby shape future ambition. The stocktake helps create a common evidence base. Instead of each country assessing progress in isolation, the international community jointly reviews where it stands, what gaps remain, and where additional effort is needed. This matters because climate governance often fails when commitments remain fragmented or politically disconnected from scientific and implementation realities. The GST creates a structured moment for reflection, pressure, and recalibration. Yet its effect still depends on follow-through. A strong stocktake without stronger domestic action will not close the ambition gap. Its value lies in turning shared assessment into a basis for improved planning, policy revision, and political accountability. Climate governance does not operate only at the global treaty level. Regional initiatives can translate broad commitments into more concrete legal and policy frameworks. The European Green Deal is a good example. Announced in 2019, it set out a broad strategic agenda for transforming the European economy through climate, energy, transport, industry, biodiversity, and finance reforms. It also explicitly linked climate action to competitiveness, innovation, and the idea of a just transition. The European Climate Law, adopted in 2021, gave this broader vision a stronger legal anchor by embedding the objective of climate neutrality and aligning the EU's longer-term trajectory with its 2030 targets. This illustrates an important point for governance analysis. International agreements often provide direction, but regional and national institutions translate that direction into enforceable law, investment signals, and sectoral policy packages. In the context of sustainable development and urban resilience, this regional layer matters greatly because implementation depends on planning systems, infrastructure decisions, mobility transitions, and public investment that occur below the global level. This illustrates an important point for governance analysis. International agreements often provide direction, but regional and national institutions translate that direction into enforceable law, investment signals, and sectoral policy packages. In the context of sustainable development and urban resilience, this regional layer matters greatly because implementation depends on planning systems, infrastructure decisions, mobility transitions, and public investment that occur below the global level. It also raises governance questions: how funding is allocated, how accountability is maintained, whether mitigation and adaptation are balanced fairly, and whether financial flows are aligned with low-emission and climate-resilient development pathways. In practice, debates over finance are often debates over trust. Without credible support arrangements, it becomes harder to sustain ambition, participation, and equity across the wider climate regime. Carbon markets remain one of the most debated tools in climate governance. Under the Paris Agreement, Article 6 provides a framework for cooperative approaches, a UN-supervised crediting mechanism, and non-market approaches. In shorthand, these are usually discussed as Articles 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. The appeal of markets is straightforward. They can, in principle, reduce mitigation costs and mobilize investment across borders. But their credibility depends on environmental integrity. One of the most important safeguards is the idea of corresponding adjustments, which are intended to prevent double counting of the same mitigation outcome. Without clear accounting, markets can create the illusion of progress while weakening real emissions reductions. This is why governance is central. Article 6 is not only about trading, it is about rules, registries, transparency, and verification. Debates about additionality, credit quality, and institutional oversight remain critical. The history from Kyoto to Paris shows that markets can support implementation, but only when accounting is strong, incentives are credible, and political actors accept common rules for integrity and trust. A major feature of contemporary climate governance is that implementation increasingly happens beyond the national state alone. Cities, regions, firms, investors, and civil society networks all play important roles. This is especially true in sectors such as buildings, transport, land use, waste, and local infrastructure, where subnational actors often control key policy levers. Cities are also central to resilience because they are where climate risks, infrastructure systems, and social vulnerability intersect most visibly. At the same time, a wider governance ecosystem creates coordination challenges. Different actors may use different metrics, reporting standards, or voluntary commitments. This can make comparability difficult and increase the risk of greenwashing or double counting. For that reason, non-state action should be seen as complementary to formal treaty governance, not a substitute for it. The challenge is to build a system in which state and non-state efforts reinforce one another. When aligned well, this broader ecosystem can speed innovation, policy diffusion, and implementation. When poorly aligned, it can fragment responsibility and weaken trust in reported progress. Despite major institutional advances, global climate governance still faces serious challenges. One of the most visible is the ambition gap. Current collective efforts remain insufficient relative to the long-term goals of 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees. A second challenge is implementation capacity. Even when targets are announced, weak institutions, unstable policy environments, or limited finance can slow delivery. A third challenge is equity. Questions of historical responsibility, capability, vulnerability, and support remain politically sensitive, and debates increasingly extend to loss and damage. A fourth challenge concerns the integrity of carbon markets and accounting systems. If cooperative mechanisms are poorly governed, they can undermine confidence rather than strengthen it. Finally, governance must achieve alignment across multiple systems at once: energy, industry, transport, land, and urban development. Climate policy is no longer a niche issue. It is interwoven with development, security, infrastructure, and social justice. Future progress will depend on whether governance systems can coordinate across these domains while remaining credible, fair, and capable of producing real implementation rather than symbolic commitment alone. The case studies in this topic help connect abstract governance mechanisms to practical outcomes. The first case, Costa Rica, looks at low-carbon mobility through a justice lens. It shows that electrification and decarbonization are not only technical transitions, they also raise questions of affordability, access, industrial capacity, and knowledge-sharing networks. A climate policy that looks successful at the national level may still produce unequal outcomes if costs and benefits are distributed unfairly. The second case, from China, examines how the clean development mechanism affected the cost price of wind power projects. This is useful because it illustrates how global carbon market arrangements can shape real investment decisions, project economics, and technology deployment. Together, the cases show that governance tools become meaningful only when they affect real systems of mobility, energy, finance, and innovation. They also reinforce a wider lesson from the lecture. Implementation is context-specific. International frameworks matter, but outcomes depend on how rules, incentives, and capacities interact within actual sectors, places, and communities. In summary, global climate governance should be understood as a layered and evolving system. The UNFCCC provides the core institutional platform. The Kyoto Protocol introduced binding targets and flexibility mechanisms, demonstrating the importance of rigorous accounting but also the limitations of narrow participation. The Paris Agreement broadened participation and created a cyclical model built around NDCs, transparency, and the global stocktake. Regional initiatives such as the European Green Deal and the European Climate Law show how global goals can be translated into law, planning, and investment signals at other governance levels. Climate finance and carbon markets remain essential but contested means of implementation, and their credibility depends on access, accountability, and environmental integrity. Finally, the growing role of cities, businesses, and networks highlights that implementation is distributed across a broader governance ecosystem. The key takeaway is that climate governance succeeds not when agreements are merely announced, but when institutions, incentives, finance, and accountability work together to produce measurable and equitable action over time.